How's it going, everyone? John Connon here with Neural DSP, and welcome to this deep dive of the Morgan Amps suite. So what makes this suite of amplifiers special? First off, all of the amplifiers are very simple and intuitive, making them very accessible and easy to use. Secondly, each of the amplifiers are very unique. They can each bring their own sonic characteristic to the table. And then finally, each of the amplifiers are all very versatile, and this can offer a wide variety of options, especially when paired with the pre and post effects. Personally, as a player that leans towards the clean edge of breakup style guitar tones, I was really drawn to these amplifiers, and I had a great deal of fun when dialing in all of the sounds and recording the parts for the track in this video. So now let's take a deep dive into this Morgan Amp suite, and I'm going to show you how to get some great sounds and get the most out of this plugin. So let's start with the heart of this plugin, the amplifiers. So here on the amplifier page, you're met with one of the three amps, the SW50R, and at the bottom you'll see three different icons, and selecting these is going to change each of the three amplifiers. We'll start at the far left with the AC20. And this first amplifier, the AC20, is going to be very Vox inspired in flavour. It's going to be chimey, and you'll see it's a very simplistic amp on the face of it. We've only got 3 dials and 2 switches. And this is still a versatile amplifier, so I'm just going to show you how it sounds with the controls currently set. So power is all the way up and cut about 3 o'clock, volume dead noon. So firstly, starting with power, this has an interesting relationship with the gain character of the amp. All the way up, you've got the same character that you just heard. Has a nice amount of drive to it when you really dig in, go on the bridge pickup. If you bring it back, it almost acts as an attenuator. So this is going to make it feel a bit more compressed and give it a different character. So what I'll do, I'm just going to bring this all the way kind of to 9 o'clock and compensate that with a boost in output. And you'll hear there that it's got even more saturation because it's been attenuated, and it's almost like everything's kind of working harder. So yes, it's a very simple control. It's almost seeming like a level control with a bit of gain on it, but it's also kind of a character switch that you can then play with the master output to get a different sound from. So let's put it in the middle, and I'll bring back the output. With the power very, very low, bring the output back up. And just so you can reference that to what it was originally, power all the way up to bring the output back to 0. So there's a change in the distortion character there, as well as the overall EQ and feel when playing through it. The next dial on from this is the cut, and this is going to act going from darker to brighter. So with it all the way to the left, nice and dark, all of those high frequencies are rolled off. All the way at noon, bit brighter, and all the way up, all of those high frequencies are let in. So you can see this cut essentially as cutting the high frequencies out if you decrease it. So let's leave that all the way up for now. And then finally we have the volume dial, and this is going to be the preamp gain and the overall volume of the amp as well. So with it at noon, sounds like that. If I bring the volume back, but then compensate and level, we'll have less of that kind of overdriven sound. Conversely, if you boost that, let's bring it to around 3 o'clock and duck the output level. We've got more of that sizzle, the saturation, and just a lot more of a pushed sound, because remember, we've still got the power all the way up. So Let's now play around with these together. We could try bringing the power down, leaving the volume where it is, and then bringing up the output as well. Or boosting the power all the way up and bringing the volume back. And conversely now, what we're going to have is kind of larger headroom because we're not attenuating the power dial and bringing that back. It's nice and open. But because we've brought the volume back, we're going to have less of that preamp gain and it's going to be less saturated. Next, we have the switches on the amplifier. The first one, we've got a sun at the top and a moon at the bottom. When it's at the bottom, that's going to be darker and the sun is going to infer a brighter sound. And to demonstrate this, what I've done, I've got the power and cut all the way up. So that's just going to make it nice and bright and push the amp a bit. And the volume's also quite high, so there's going to be a lot of preamp gain. And that's just going to make this high frequency control a bit more audible in difference. So that's how it sounds without the bright switch engaged. Let's bring it in. Let's take it off. Back in. And then below that, we've also got a bass boost. So I've put the dark switch, just left it in the dark mode. And now we see a bass clef and a treble clef, where bass clef is going to mean it's going to be a bit, bassier with more low end, and then treble clef is going to be a bit brighter. So in the treble mode, here's how it sounds. With the bass boost engaged. And I could really feel that low end in the room, and it was changing how I played as well. And finally, to round this amp off, we then have the standby and on switches. So you can bypass these if you want, or creatively, if you're using this in a recording scenario, automate these to bypass the amp if you wish as well. And as an added little Easter egg on top, by selecting and clicking the Morgan logo, you can change the skin of the amps as well. Moving on to the second amp in this suite, we have the PR12, and this is going to be very reminiscent of those famous clean American style amplifiers. And in terms of layout, we start off on the far left again with an on and a standby switch if you want to use those. And the first thing to note about this amplifier is that it's a very clean amplifier. So if I just play a chord with the reverb off for now and bass, treble and volume at noon, sounds like this. We've got tons of headroom, it's bright, and it's also got a bit of a push. It's not a very compressed amplifier, and it's great for a pedal platform, great for clean sounds, all of that sort of stuff. Starting on the far left then with the reverb controls, Dwell is going to affect the decay of the reverb. So if I just set reverb currently at 50, that's not 50% mix, that's just going to be 50% of the amount of reverb you can add. But reverb at noon and the dwell at noon sounds like this. If I bring the dwell all the way down, that decay almost doesn't exist. It's very, very dry and dark. If I bring that all the way up, however, you'll be able to hear now that with the dwell all the way up, you can really hear that spring reverb character coming through. So now, just to demonstrate this even further, I'm just going to put the reverb and dwell quite high up, not all the way, but just to give it an obvious sense of that reverb being part of the amped sound and do something that suits that rockabilly country kind of style. Next, let's have a look at the bass and treble dials. While this is really just a two-band EQ section to this amplifier, these are very powerful and they can influence the character of the drive when pushing this amplifier. So with bass, treble and volume all at noon, so now what I'm going to do is push the volume to around about 3 o'clock just to make these changes to the bass and treble a bit more audible. Now I've got a bit more gain, so when I drive and play a bit harder, it's going to drive the amp. Going to have a bit more level, a bit more saturation, just as these kind of amplifiers do in real life. When you push the volume, it's going to be a bit more aggressive. So let's bring back the bass. If I push the bass all the way, it gives the kind of saturation and overdrive of the amplifier a lot more of a thick, weighty feel to it. So if I do the same thing with treble, I'll put bass back to noon, bring it back. Especially when on the neck pickup there, it's very warm and rounded sounding, and it almost takes the kind of sizzle and top off of the saturation. Conversely, if I push that now, almost all the way, we've now got all of that top end back in, and this treble has kind of pushed all of that through. So, as you have now seen and heard, with the volume, this can drastically affect the character of the amplifier. If I bring it back from 3 o'clock to midday, we should clean up right away. And similarly, if I bring it back even further and boost the output, even when really digging in on a bridge sound, we've still got tons of headroom and the amp's not clipping. However, if you really want to get that pushed amplifier that's about to blow up type sound, you can push the volume all the way up and of course bring the output down a bit to compensate, if you'd had it up for lower volume styles. And it sounds just like that, just again as the real amp would. So. And when paired with the EQ, let's boost the treble, bring back the bass. We can get almost quite, high-ish gain, pushed clean crunch sounds. And that's from a clean amplifier. So this has got a ton of scope, just like the other amplifiers do in this suite, but this one especially, just with one volume dial and 2 EQ controls, allow you to get a vast range of sounds, especially with different gain characteristics. Moving on to the third and final amplifier in this suite, we have the SW50R. And this is an extremely flexible boutique one-channel amplifier that's going to be perfect from cleans to breakup all the way to crunch lead sounds as well. So having a look at the controls, again, we have an on and standby switch, which you can toggle if you wish. And it's going to make sense here to talk about the features on the amplifier from right to left, because really that's going to be the flow of signal through the amplifier. So starting off at the right with the volume, this is going to be the preamp gain. So I've set everything fairly neutral, and with the volume at noon, sounds like this. So we've got a bit of fizz and breakup if we really push it. Again, I'm on the bridge pickup here. If I was to go on a middle pickup sound. This is a very reactive amp to, the input that you give it, essentially. So with the volume at noon, it's got a kind of in-between character. It's clean if you play dynamically, but also, if you really dig in, can start to break up. If we bring it back, we're going to have even more headroom, so there's going to be kind of less preamp gain. And what I'm going to do is just push the output as well of the overall plugin. Tons of headroom, right? So if we push the volume now and compensate, we'll duck the master output a bit. You'll hear there we've got a lot more gain immediately, similar to the PR12, but here we're going to have a lot more on tap. So let's push this all the way. And now I'm just going to set this to noon. And next to that, we then have the brightness switch as well as the bass boost as usual. So with the volume at noon, I'm going to bring in the bright switch. With the brightness switch off. Back on, I'm also just going to push the volume. And off again, darker. Same thing again. So bass boost, this is just going to give it more low end thump. Bass boost disengaged. Bass boost on and the treble boost engaged. And when pushing the volume with this, you'll get the kind of top end fizz and preamp saturation, as well as the kind of low end thump and richness from that bass boost as well. So I've put the volume back at noon, I've disengaged the bright switch as well as the bass boost switch, and it's time to have a look at bass, middle and treble on this amp. The important thing to note with this is that this 3-band EQ is before the distortion stage of the amplifier, meaning that you can dial these in and really drastically affect the character of the drive that this amp has. With the bass, middle and treble at noon, sounds like this. Bringing in more of the volume to get more saturation. This is going to make the EQ change a lot more noticeable and vivid. So bringing the bass back. Gives it less of a body. I could bring that all the way off. However, if I push it all the way, we've got a lot of thump and richness, even with the kind of higher string notes as well, not just the chord. So that's going to be essentially adding a low shelf underneath all of that distortion. Bringing back the mids, scooping them all the way, sounds like this. And what that's done is kind of hollowed out the sound and given it less to drive the distortion of the amp with. So maybe if you wanted to kind of back it off, make it less aggressive, this mid control can be used to do that. Or conversely, if you push the mids all the way up, that's going to give a lot more of a bump in the mid-range that can push the amp a bit harder and get a bit more saturation, as you heard there as well. Onto the treble dial. If you bring this back, this is going to take the transient attack of your notes off and remove some of that picking aggression as well. So. And when you're on the neck pickup, this can really smooth it out and make it nice and round. However, if you wanted more bite and aggression, push this, bridge pickup maybe. And likewise, same with bass and mids. By pushing the treble, you're going to give a bit of a signal boost in that particular frequency range and get a bit more saturation, drive, sustain as well. Then finally, we're on to the level dial. This is in white. This is going to be a lot more of a master volume output control. And while it is a master volume, it's still going to affect the character of the gain slightly. So with it at around 10, 11 o'clock, a nice amount of bite. Let's push it even further and compensate with the output, bringing that down. And you heard there we've got more drive, more sustain, and a bit more kind of low-end oomph to the sound as well. And we can dial that back as well if we wanted. So bringing the level down to around 9 o'clock with the volume still all the way up. It's going to clean it up, give it less kind of impact and thump, and give it a different character to the overdrive. And whilst we're here, it's worth showing the amount of gain that this amplifier has on tap. So if you really dime the level and the volume all the way up, let's maybe push the treble, duck the mids, leave the bass where it is, bring the bright switch in. This is going to just push the amplifier, give it lots of saturation, preamp and master volume type drive, and you can get some lead sounds with it as well. And finally, this ends on the reverb dial. So dialing this in, it's going to give it a bit more ambience. It's going to be a similar spring type sound. If we accentuate this all the way up, you've got a very dramatic spring reverb effect. Let's bring this in around 75% and just give a bit of ambience to this lead sound that we've got. And as is the case with the previous amplifiers, we've also got an on-off switch and a standby here as well. And that basically covers it for this third amp in the suite, the SW50R. So these three amps in the suite then, each offer something unique. And when I was making the track for this video, I was leaning towards each amplifier for specific scenarios and parts. The first amp, the AC20, that was what I was using for the main picked motif. It had enough drive to carry itself and have some sustain to it and punch, but it didn't have enough sustain to do the lead stuff, but it was great for that mid-gain territory. The PR12, I used that for anything that was suitable for clean sounds. It meant that I could dig in on chords and it not get too abrasive or distorted. And finally, the SW50R was used for most of the lead work in the track. It offered the most amount of gain on tap, a different sonic quality with a different mid-range and push to it, and I thought it worked really, really great for those singing sustained lead sounds. And when dialing in those sounds, I genuinely found each of these three amplifiers simple to use, unique and versatile, each in their own right. Now let's have a look at the pre-effects section. At the top of the plugin, at the various icons, you can access different areas of the plugin. We're going to do the far left one. Selecting that will bring up these pre-effects. At the far left, we've got a compressor pedal. Selecting the bypass switch will turn the light on for the M in Morgan. And you'll see here we've got three dials. We've got comp for compression, level and mix, as well as a fast and slow switch. With the compressor pedal bypassed, my amp sound sounds like this. So we've got a bit of breakup when digging in, but really it's a kind of clean edge of breakup sound. If we bring in this compressor with the current settings, as I'm playing there, I can feel it clamping down on the transients and giving less of a dynamic range to the tone. At the top left, we've got a compression dial, and this is going to determine the amount of compression applied to my signal. With it towards the left, we're going to have a very subtle compression effect. With it all the way up, we'll have a very vivid, obvious compression effect with limited dynamic range instead. And with the compression this high, it's going to affect the amount of drive that can push the amplifier. And that's going to be something to consider when playing with compression, because you may want to have that dynamic range and also that range of drive that you can get when pushing and pulling with the amp. So just bear that in mind when dialing in the compression. So for now, I'm going to leave that halfway, and that's going to give me a nice compromise between a compressed, sustained, consistent sound while still giving me a bit of headroom to push the amp a bit if I drive and play a bit harder. Next to this, we then have the fast and slow switch. With this, it's going to determine the release time, not the attack time. And the best way to demonstrate this is just doing a quick transient. So, you'll see there on the slow setting, the compression died away at a slow rate. If we go into the fast setting, the compression dies away really quickly. So that's going to have a different sound. On fast, you'll be able to get a bit more of a punchier, less compressed type feel. So now on the slow setting. There, the compression is pinning down those transients and sustaining the chords out for a bit longer and giving it a different feel. So that's another way you can affect the character of your guitar sound, but also how it reacts with the amps as well. After that, we've then got a level. This is going to be the overall output of the pedal. So if you use compression, that's going to limit the dynamic range and often make the guitar sound quieter. So this can be used as makeup gain or to drive the amp more or less. So with the current settings, I'm just going to play with the level as it is at around 1:30, 2 o'clock. If I brought this back, you'll be able to hear there that the amp's cleaned up a lot. However, if I then pushed it all the way, we're going to have that nice, consistent, compressed signal going into the amp at a higher level and driving the amp as well and getting more saturation as a result. Below that, we've then got a mix dial, and this is going to be a blend of your dry, uncompressed guitar sound as well as the compressed sound from the pedal. And currently the mix has been at 100%, so you're just hearing the compressed guitar sound. If I put this at 50%, that's going to be a 50-50 blend of my uncompressed guitar and the compressed pedal signal. All the way off, it's just going to be the uncompressed guitar. And this could be another way to achieve a consistent guitar sound, yet still retaining a dynamic range that allows you to punch through and give a bit of drive to the amp if you wish. So let's put it in the middle, and you'll hear that I can play quietly and the compressor will still sustain out the chords, but when I dig in, we can still drive the amp a bit as well. Next, we're going to move over to the first overdrive pedal. This is going to be very much reminiscent of that classic tube screamer type circuit. So we can use this to add a bit of punch, drive, and oomph to the existing amp sound, give a bit of saturation, roll off the low end a bit, and just give it a bit more energy. So without the pedal engaged, sounds like this. And now with overdrive 1 engaged with all of the settings that you see on screen. So the first control, the drive control, is going to determine how much drive is added to the signal. With it at its minimum, it's going to be, at its cleanest, add a bit of oomph to the signal, but really not adding much drive at all. And really there, all the push is coming from the level of the pedal. As you increase this drive though, we're going to get a lot more saturation with the drive increased. All the way up. So we've got a lot more sustain, saturation, and we're pushing the amp a bit harder as well. Next, the level control of overdrive 1 is going to determine the output level from this pedal. So at higher values, you'll drive the amp a bit more, and at lower values, you'll clean it up a bit as well. So with it at noon, as well as the drive, sounds like this. Bring the level back, clean it up. Or push the amp even further. This can be used in combination with the gain if you wanted to push the amp and get more of the amp distortion, but not necessarily the drive from the pedal. And this is a common way of dialing in a tube screamer type circuit if you wanted to use it to push the input signal into the amp, but not get the drive from the pedal. So the drive is quite low, and conversely, the level is almost at its max. And just before I demonstrate this, here's how the amp sounds without the pedal, just as a reminder. And now with overdrive 1. The drive pedal there isn't added any drive per se, it's just giving the amp a bit more energy. And finally, we're on to the tone dial, and this can control the high frequencies. At its minimum value, you'll have a darker sound, and all the way open at its far right, you're gonna let all those high frequencies through. So with it to the left, again, we'll keep similar settings, we'll just push the drive a bit. And with the tone at its lowest, you can get rounded, nice, warm lead sounds. With the tone at noon, you'll get a bit brighter. And then tone all the way up, you're going to get all that pick attack, all of the sizzle from the amp will come through, and just a generally brighter, more aggressive sound. Moving on to overdrive 2, this is going to be a bit more aggressive in nature and have a bit more overdrive and saturation on tap. And this overdrive 2 is going to be great for reproducing the sound of your guitar without coloring it like many overdrives do. It's not going to have the mid-hump that the first overdrive pedal does, it'll just push the amp harder and retain the sound of your guitar as well. So here's how my guitar sounds without overdrive 2 engaged. And now let's engage overdrive 2. So that's really pushed the amplifier, and that's with the current settings as well, and nothing is maxed out, so there's a lot on tap in this pedal. Let's put everything to noon. Starting at the gain dial, this is going to be the gain control, and this will just determine how much gain is added to the signal. With it at noon, it sounds like this. So a healthy amount, again, remember, this was our original amp sound. And with overdrive 2. It's retained a similar EQ characteristic, it's just driven the amp a lot more and added some saturation. So we can bring this back. And with it at lower values, it's going to add less compression and saturation, so you can still get that dynamic range and play quietly. It can clean up with your fingers. But on a bridge pickup, you can really drive it as well. So let's now push it to about 3/4. And just there, it was making me play with a lot more fluidity, adding a bit more legato because you've got that natural sustain and compression that lends itself really well to that type of playing. So we could push this even further, all the way up. On top of this, we've got a level control, and similar to overdrive 1, increasing this can push the amp even further. So now what I've done, I've pushed level and I've left gain at midday. We could also then add the gain in. So we're going to add some drive from the pedal as well as level from the pedal and push the amp even harder. And there it was encouraging a bit of feedback and changing the way I was playing and just giving you that more saturated, aggressive lead sound. Now we can use the bass and treble dials to shape the sound even further. And as we're using so much gain, we're getting quite a lot of that low end that just gets in the way. So using this bass dial, we'll bring it back, and this should have cleaned up and given us some more control over the low end. So even there, with a neck pickup on power chords down the bottom end of the fretboard, it's not getting too out of control in the low end. Similarly, with the treble dial, we could roll this back and roll off some of that top end if it's getting a bit abrasive. Let's roll it off all the way. So while this pedal is aggressive in nature, it's got a bit more gain on tap and saturation if you want to use it. It can also be used to create a more smoother singing sustained lead sound if that's what you're going for as well. Or on the other hand, you may want to go for a bright, aggressive, distorted rhythm sound. Here again, I'm using single coils. We're going to get a bit of a brighter transient, but I've also backed off the bass, boosted the treble, and the gain and level are quite high, they're nice and healthy, so we should get a nice, thick, rich, saturated rhythm sound. So if you want, you can get into the aggressive metal-ish territory as well with these. They're very flexible devices as well as the amps as well. Now onto the fourth and final pedal in the pre-effects, we have a tremolo pedal, and this is going to be a volume modulation device. At the top left, let's turn it on, we then have the rate control, and this will determine the speed at which the volume changes. So with it set at around 11 o'clock, you're going to hear a steady kind of flow between loud, quieter, and then loud. With this to the left, you're going to have a slower rate, so let's put it at around 8, 9 o'clock. A very slow, subtle rate there. And then if we raise that, put it around 3, 4 o'clock. It's very quick. So let's put it at around midday. Next, we're on to the sync and free toggle switch. In sync mode, it will sync to the tempo of the plugin when you're using standalone, or the tempo of the DAW session that you're running the plugin in. When in free mode, it won't be dependent on either of those, and you'll be able to set the rate to a value in milliseconds. So with the current rate setting in sync mode, we're at 120 beats per minute, and it sounds like this. However, if I select a higher BPM, you'll hear that the rate will stay the same in regards to the BPM, but it will sound quicker because we've got a faster beats per minute. So, however, if you want to do it by ear, in either mode, you can play a note and cycle through the rate and find the speed that suits you. Next, we're on to the depth dial, and currently this is set around 2 o'clock, and that's giving a decent depth to make this tremolo obvious. It's ducking the volume quite considerably. However, if we dial this in subtly and put the depth around 9 o'clock, you're going to get a very light tremolo effect. It's going to be a very shallow version where the volume doesn't dip much. However, if we raise the depth, put it around 3, 4 o'clock, going to have a lot more of a vivid, throbbing tremolo effect. All the way up, it sounds like this. And there, the depth is going all the way from 100% volume all the way to 0. Finally, you've then got a level control, and this can be used as a master output for this pedal. Again, you can use this to drive the amp harder or clean it up. So now I'm just going to dial in a sound with it. I'm going to put the rate back a bit. I've put the depth around about 2, 3 o'clock. The level pushed a bit just to get a bit more drive out of the amplifier. And here's how it sounds. And due to the nature of these 3 amplifiers, using this level dial, you could raise it even further and have the volume difference interact with the gain of the amplifiers. So let's just push it to around 3, 4 p.m. And just to round off these pre-effects then, we have 4 devices that are super flexible in achieving a wide range of sounds. Let's have a look at dialing them in combination and see what sounds we can get. The first sound I'm going to go for is a very clean and compressed tone with tremolo as well. So without any of the pedals engaged, sounds like this. I'm going to engage the compressor. And immediately we've got too much level. So I'm going to bring that down and it should clean the amp up. I'm going to keep the toggle on slow. I'm going to raise the compression. That's just giving us a bit more sustain. The mix, I'm going to put about 75%. I might bring the level back a bit. That way, the compressor is preventing me from clipping the amp and getting any sort of breakup. Now let's engage the tremolo pedal. And with the current settings, it sounds like this. Again, I'm going to bring the level back down. And also have a slightly more subtle effect by bringing the depth back. I like the rate where it is, and here's how these settings sound. Now let's go for a singing, sustained lead sound with tons of saturation, but let's also roll it off and make it nice and warm and soothing as well. So let's bring in the compressor. I'm going to have a fast attack for this because I still want the transient of the notes to come through and have it kind of spongy in feel. So let's just play around with actually engaging overdrive 2 for now. Yeah, that feels about right. You can see on the meter, still having a bit of compression that's being applied. We've still got quite a high mix, but we're not pinning it too much. Take all of the dynamic range out of it. So we'll meet it halfway around 3 o'clock. Let's keep the level at noon, have a nice amount of drive for that. The gain and level, I'm going to keep where they are. But on overdrive 2, we've boosted the treble, and that's given it a lot of high end. So I'm going to roll that back. And I could roll it even further off. But I've also got overdrive 1 to play with. So I'm going to leave that just around 9, 10 o'clock. Bring the bass back in just to give it some low end fundamental. Bring in overdrive 1, and let's try everything with a bit of drive, level around noon, and tone at noon, and just see what that adds. So we've still got a bit of sizzle there. It rounds off a bit when I'm on the neck pickup, but let's just experiment, bringing the tone down even further. So for me, that has the right amount of top to still cut through a mix, but not be too overbearing and too aggressive with some of the fast picking that can kind of get a bit spiky. If I bring these tones and trebles back in, that's going to become a lot more prominent and a bit more abrasive. And you can totally get those sounds from this as well. Now we're on to the cab section, and in this Morgan amp suite we have a 1x12 Celestion Creamback speaker. And if you've used any of our other plugins before, this interface will be very familiar to you. And over at the left side of this cab page, we have a drop-down menu for this first microphone. I've bypassed the second microphone, so you're just going to be hearing this one microphone for now. Currently it's on a Dynamic 57 model, as you can see here, and it's in this area of the cone, and it sounds like this. Let's change that to a 57 off axis. So that'll be a bit darker. Maybe change it to a condenser 4006. Or maybe a ribbon 121. And next to this microphone drop-down menu, you've got this on-off switch where you can bypass that particular IR if you wish. Below that, we then have 4 dials. These are going to relate to the position of the microphone and the volume and panning of this microphone. So, if you change the position, you'll see this is going from the center of the cone, where it's going to have a brighter sound, all the way to the edge of the cone, where you're going to have a rolled off darker sound. And this could be anywhere in between those two extremes, so let's go in the middle. And double clicking it will reset it to the current position, where it's kind of in between all of those. And a nice compromise. Next to that, we then have the distance. So currently this is set at 0.1, but if you increase this, this will increase the distance the microphone is from the speaker grill. So with it at 0.1, now it's all the way out, it's at 1. We've lost that upfrontness, lots of the body is gone. Whereas all the way close up on the grill, you've got all that low end, almost from that proximity effect that microphones have when they're right up against the source. But again, we could go anywhere in between that. Let's go around 0.5. And all of these are applicable to any of the microphones from the drop-down menu, just as another note. Below that, we've then got a level for this particular microphone. Again, you can have 2 microphones simultaneously in this cab section on the same cabinet, and we've got identical parameters on the far right. and you could blend these with the mic level, and we'll get to that just in a minute. Next to that, we then have a pan control, and this means that you can pan a microphone in the left, as you see it, and in the right, and have a stereo spread, each with its own individual character. Below that, we've then got a phase switch, where you can invert the phase of that particular impulse response if you wish as well. And just before we get into blending some combinations of microphones, in the drop-down menu, you'll see right at the bottom, you can load custom impulse responses if you wish to use them in the plugin as well. So let's take this dynamic 57 sound and blend it with another microphone. By nature, 57s are quite bright, so I'm just going to bring the output down and engage the second impulse response. And let's add a ribbon 121. If I bypass the first mic, the 57, the ribbon mic sounds like this. So very warm, loads of low end, and almost the antithesis and the opposite of that 57. So what we could do is kind of meet that in the middle, make it a bit brighter. It's not going to be as bright as a 57, so let's click and drag the microphone towards the center of the speaker cone, and you'll see these parameters have changed and corresponded with that. Let's also change the mic level and bring it down a bit, just to 0, so it's the same level as the 57. Now what we can do is re-engage the 57, and this is going to be a 50-50 blend, both of them down the center. We may want to have a more brighter tone, so let's push the 57 by about 2.5 dB. If I bypass the ribbon, all the low end will go out and you'll kind of miss that extra weight and body that the ribbon mic added. Bringing back in the ribbon mic. You can see there how adding two microphones can really shape and give further character to a sound. And just because we can, let's pan the 57 hard left and the ribbon mic hard right. So now it's in stereo. You'll hear the 57 in the left speaker and the ribbon mic in the right. And on top of this, if you wanted to tweak your amp's parameters, you'll see here that you can visualize the panel of the amplifier, and you can also adjust the parameters on the amp in real time whilst changing the microphone parameters as well. And on top of that, if you wanted to switch out the heads, just select the models at the bottom and they correspond visually as well. Now let's take a look at the EQ section. This is a 9-band graphic equalizer where we've got specific faders controlling specific frequencies. And on top of that, we also have high pass and low pass filters as well. So this is going to be a fine tuning device where you can alter the character of the EQ. That's going to be after your cabinet, after your amplifier, and after your pre-effects. So let's use this to our advantage and get some sounds. So currently, I've got a tone dialed in using the PR12 amp model, as you'll see at the bottom. And the look of the EQ is slightly different. That's because each of the amplifiers have a designated look for the EQ, so you can know which amp you're working with. With this PR12 sound, it's got a lot of mid-range inherently in the sound. And I may want to duck some of that out. So if I go to the 1 kilohertz fader, that's going to be a very prominent musical mid-range, and I feel like that, if I boost it, will just accentuate the problem area. So let's just see. Yeah, that's the area I want to pull out. So what I can do is drag this down, and you'll see up top, we've got a decibel reading of how much you're pulling this down. So while it may look like a tiny amount that we're ducking this, 4 dBs is actually quite a drastic change with EQ. And it can go all the way down to -12 if you really wish. That may be a bit extreme, so I'm just going to duck it to -6 or so. And now that's a kind of classic, more aggressive rock, scooped type of rhythm crunch sound. Now I've got a sound dialed in using the SW50R, and this is a lot higher gain, and we've also got a fair amount of low end in this that I'm going to try and carve out with the EQ and control the low end a bit. So here's how the tone sounds without any of the EQ engaged. I still like the thick character of that because it's come from engaging quite a few gain stages in the pedals and pushing the amps, but that low end's just getting a bit too much. So, using the high pass filter control, this can roll off the low end from a frequency. If I roll it too high, like 500 Hertz, it's going to remove too much. But in a creative way, you can use that as almost a lo-fi megaphone type effect. But for now, we still want to keep some of that low range in. So let's try at around 250, see what that sounds like. I feel like it's lost the very low end fundamental information. So what I can do is bring it back to, say, 100 Hertz. But there's still something annoying in the low mid range. So if I go to the 125 Hertz fader and pull that down to maybe -5 and a bit of 250, that should carve out a bit of room in that low mid, so it should still feel nice and warm in the very low end, but not be too annoying in that low mid area. So. And you can see very quickly that that's solved that initial problem that I had. If I bypass the EQ with this toggle switch, then engage it, the EQ then has shaped the sound, still kept the character that I wanted, but just tidied it up a bit and controlled it essentially. And with this next sound, I have a mid-gain crunch tone that's got a nice general overall EQ. But in the context of a mix in a live setting, you may want a bit more mid-range to that. So I'm on the AC20 EQ, and what I'm going to do is keep the high pass filter where it is because I want all of that low end fundamental note information. But now I'm actually going to boost around the mid-range. So at 1K, I'm going to bring in 3 dB. If I bypass it, hear how it sounded without. By popping it in, it's just giving it a nudge in the mid-range. It's a lot more audible what note I'm playing. Let's also push 500 and 2 kilohertz just to give it a bit of context, as well as 1 kilohertz. Let's push it actually all the way to about 5 dB. See how that sounds. And that's given it a nice additive boost of EQ. So you can hopefully hear now that this EQ can be a very powerful tool in adding that final touch to your guitar tones when dialing them in. It can be used as a subtractive EQ or an additive EQ to really shape the sound and add those final touches. Now let's move on to the post effects section. In the Morgan Amp suite, we have two post-effect devices. We have a tape delay and a hall reverb. And while there are just two devices here, these are extremely versatile and flexible devices that can add a lot of depth and color to the sound. So first, looking at the delay. This is modeled after a real tape delay, so you're going to get all of those authentic sounding tape delay effects here. And to turn this on, you just select the bypass foot switch at the bottom left. And the first dial we've got is the mix control, and this is just going to be a dry, wet blend of dry guitar and reverb. So currently, with all of the current settings, sounds like this. Of course, this could be a bit more vivid if we turn this up. So let's go just above 50%. So this sounds like. Next to the mix, we have a sync switch, and you've got three modes available for this. Currently, we're in app mode because we're using the app in standalone. If you're using the Morgan Amp suite in a DAW, then this would say DAW. And that means that the time of the delay repeats is set to either the tempo in the app, currently we're at 120 beats per minute there at the bottom, or the tempo of your DAW session. And currently, at 120 beats per minute, the delay is repeating at a quarter note. We can change this by dragging and turning the time dial. So let's maybe try a half note triplet. And you'll hear that as I change it, you get that realistic tape delay sound as the delays are speeding up or slowing down. This is a 16th. And you can get almost pseudo slapback rhythmic effects with this as well. And now if we increase the time to a quarter note that's dotted, this is going to be in sync with 120 beats per minute because that is what the app's set to. And this will allow us to get those broader, elongated, longer delay sounds for a more ambient style. The mode to the right of this, we can select by clicking and dragging right on the sync toggle switch. And now we're in tap. So this means that the tap tempo of the pedal can be set. And as I click, you'll see the digital display change the BPM. And this then means that the time and the subdivisions will relate to that BPM. And it's important to note here that this is independent of the BPM set at the bottom of the plugin. And this means that you could have other effects in the plugin set to the BPM of the plugin, such as the tremolo in the pre-effects, but still have control over the BPM and time and subdivisions of the delay. And the third and final mode of this tape delay is the free mode. So clicking the sync, dragging it left, you'll see now that the BPM in the digital display is grayed out because that's irrelevant, as we're now changing the time of the delay repeats in milliseconds as shown when you adjust the time dial. To the right of this, we then have another toggle switch, which allows us to either engage or disengage a ping pong mode for the delay repeats. And this means that each delay repeat will go either left or right in the stereo field independently. And with the current time setting of 449 milliseconds, you'll hear it go from left to right with the delay repeats. However, if I now toggle this ping pong switch to off, the delay repeats won't go left and right independently, they'll go through left and right at the same time. However, it's important to note that this is still a stereo tape delay, so even when ping pong isn't engaged, the delay repeats will have a nice width to them and you should be able to hear that. Next to this, we then have the feedback dial, and this, in simple terms, means the amount of repeats of delay. So with the feedback dial towards the left, this is just going to be 1 or 2 delay repeats. And as you increase this, you'll have more delay repeats around the middle. If you increase the feedback control, here I've got it at around 3 o'clock, you can get almost infinite delay repeats, and it may even start to self-oscillate. However, if this happens, you can still use this like you would with a real tape delay and have fun being creative with the time and the repeats and getting that cool self-oscillating sound. And on top of this, you could connect an expression pedal or automate any of these parameters and get really creative with this tape delay. Or you could use it in a more traditional sense and use it in a nice, subtle way just to add that tape delay sound. On the next row below, at the far left, we have this white high-pass filter. So as you increase this, what it's going to do is roll off the low end of the delay repeats, not your dry guitar signal. And this can be useful because it can remove the muddiness, especially when you're playing chords with delay, as all that low-end information may build up. And on top of that, it's going to degrade the delay repeats each time as well. So it's a genuine tape delay effect. So with none of this high-pass effect applied, it's all the way to the left, and here's how it sounds. However, as we increase this, we can roll off some of that low end, so putting it just over halfway. And if we dial this high pass all the way to the extreme at the far right, you can hear how vivid this effect can be. The next control is the time dial, and turning this allows you to determine the speed at which the delay repeats occur, whether that's in milliseconds or at a specific subdivision when either in app, DAW or tap mode. The next dial across is tape drive, and increasing this from left to right will add saturation and warmth to the delay repeats and give them a slightly distorted character. With the tape drive all the way to the left, the delay repeats are going to be nice and clean. If I increase that to halfway, we'll get some of that saturation in. And then all the way to the right, the saturation effect will be at its most vivid. And this can be used to add that grit and almost lo-fi texture to distorted crunch breakup leads. So just as a quick demo of that. Next we have a width dial, and this is going to control the stereo spread of the delay repeats. It's important to note that the width dial acts differently depending on which mode you're in, i.e. whether ping pong mode is engaged or bypassed. So currently we're not in ping pong mode and the width is all the way to the left. So that means that the stereo effect of the tape delay is going to feel very mono at the center. As I increase this halfway, this stereo effect is going to feel a bit wider. And then with width at its maximum, you'll get the most vivid width and stereo effect to the delay repeats. With width at its most minimum value, this means that the ping pong effect is going to be very subtle and the ping pong effect is going to feel very mono in the center. And again, as you increase this, this means that the ping pong effect is going to feel like it's going further left than right. And then at its maximum. And the reason for this is that sometimes when you're wearing headphones, a ping pong effect can feel very drastic and very disorientating sometimes. So if you want to rein that back a bit, you can use this width effect to determine how wide that ping pong effect is. And finally, at the far right, we're on to a low pass control. So this is going to roll off the high end from the delay repeats, not your guitar signal. So with it at its maximum, this is how the delay sounds. Now I'll bring it down halfway, and the delay repeats will get a bit darker. And then at its minimum value, these delay repeats are going to feel nice and dark. And then below this low pass filter, we have the tap tempo if you're in a mode that can allow the tap tempo feature. So when in tap mode with the sync feature, you can tap this tap tempo at any tempo you wish, and it will come up in the digital display. And you can use this in a creative way when dialing in lead sounds. So currently I've got quite a bright lead sound. And all of that high-end sizzle can get in the way with multiple delay repeats going on at the same time. So I can use this low-pass feature to bring back and attenuate all those high frequencies so that my actual dry guitar signal sits above that cloud of the warm delays underneath, and it sounds like this. Now moving on to the reverb device. This is based on a very famous 80s studio reverb, and it's going to complement the spring reverbs in the amps very nicely. The first control is the mix dial. This will be a dry-wet blend of your dry guitar signal and the wet hall reverb. So let's engage this reverb pedal with the bypass foot switch, and with the mix at around 10 o'clock, it sounds like this. And this can be dialed in more subtly, just for a bit of ambience, so around 7 o'clock. Or you could push this mix all the way up and get a very obvious ambient in the room type sound. Next to this, we then have the pre-delay dial, and this will determine the amount of time between my initial transient and the reverb occurring. So currently, it's set at around 10 o'clock. If I play a chord, there'll be a short time between that chord and then all the reverb occurring. So if I elongated this all the way up, you'll hear a bigger interval between my initial guitar hit and then all of the reverb coming in. And this can be used creatively to mimic smaller or larger spaces, as smaller spaces will have a very fast pre-delay and larger spaces will have a bigger interval and therefore a larger pre-delay. Next to this, we then have the decay, and this is going to be the length of the reverb tail. So with it at noon, it's going to be a fairly strong, nice, broad reverb tail. If I brought this down, I can then mimic a kind of smaller, tighter room sound. This decay dial can take us anywhere from 1 second to 60 seconds at its most extreme. And as you've just heard, we've had a very short reverb time there for the decay. And if you increase the decay dial all the way up to its maximum at 60 seconds, this can create a very long, drawn-out ambient reverb tail that's a lot of fun to improvise over. So as you can hear, you can get long, drawn-out ambience from this reverb as well. And it's worth noting that as I bypassed it there, the reverb tail still continued. If you wanted to have a dead stop to the reverb, all you'd do is bypass the post-effects section. You can automate this as well in a DAW and double-click it at the top. And then all of the reverb tails should cease. Below this, at the left, we have a high-pass filter, similar to the tape delay. Rolling this in will take off that low end. So with it to its left, you'll have a darker, warmer, bassier reverb. And with it to the right, it's going to be a brighter, less low-end heavy reverb tail. With the high-pass filter all the way to the left, it sounds like this. Let's bring this halfway, and we'll have a less low-end heavy reverb. And at its maximum, we'll have a nice light reverb. And inversely, on the right, we have a low-pass filter. So as you turn this towards the left, it's going to roll off all of those high frequencies and you'll get a darker reverb tail. So with it at its maximum, all these high frequencies are going to come through and it sounds like this. At halfway. And at the far left, you'll have a nice dark reverb tail. So that rounds out this reverb pedal. As you can hear, both of these devices are very expressive in their own right, but when combined, they can lead to some really cool sounds. So let's have a look at a few examples of how you could combine the two. So first, let's create a short decay, slapback in the room type sound. So starting off with the delay, I've created quite a high mix because I wanted a vivid slapback style sound. So you can hear that, it's very obviously there, but as is the case with slapback, I've got a short feedback because you just want 1 or 2 repeats, almost like a kind of early reflection type delay. I've rolled off loads of the lows because I don't want it to get too heavy in the low end. I've left all the highs in to get that bright sparkle from it, and I've added a bit of drive just for a bit of color. On the reverb, I've done a similar thing. I've rolled off all the lows, kept the highs in, had a short decay, added a bit of a pre-delay just for a bit of a room reflection sound, and then with the mix, I've kept that nice and high, around 40–45%. So as you could hear, that was a very quick decay in the room type sound that added that extra flavor to really make that sound authentic. Next, let's have a look at a long drawn out ambient sound. So for this ambient sound, what I've got is the delay with, again, a healthy mix just below 50%, a very healthy feedback, so that's going to be plenty of delay repeats. I've also got a bit of the low end still in, just so it's nice and warm, but I've dialed back the high frequencies, so again, it's got that warm character to the delay repeats. I've got no drive because I want it to be nice and clean. The width is all the way up and I'm on ping pong mode, so it's going to be a very wide ping pong effect there as well, and a medium delay repeat time as well of around 500 milliseconds. On the reverb, I've got a very high mix, over 50%, so it's going to feel very wet and ambient. No pre-delay because I want it to be almost instant as I start playing. The decay is not too long because it can get in the way of chord changes and stuff, so it's just below 50%. The lows are rolled off because I don't want that to get in the way with the chord changes again, and the highs are also backed off to around about 9–10 o'clock because that's just going to get in the way. I want this reverb to be a nice warm cloud underneath everything. So here's how it sounds. Now we're into the global features of this plugin. So at the top left, we have the input dial. This can be used to either increase or attenuate the level of your guitar going into the plugin. So at 0, you're going to have a standard input for the amplifiers. As you can see, it's not too low, but it's not clipping, importantly. If you raise it, you can drive the amps a bit harder. Or conversely, if you back it off, the amps can clean up a bit as well. So this can be a further gain staging control before you hit the plugin. Next to that, we then have the gate. By default, this is set at minus 80 decibels, and this is just going to remove any unwanted noise that may be inherent in your setup. You can bypass this with the little toggle switch at the top if you want no noise gate and get all of the nuance out of your playing. This, at its minimum, can be set at minus 96 dB, but at its maximum, you can go all the way up to 0 dB if you wish. Next to this, we then have a transpose dial. This can increase or decrease the pitch of your guitar by 12 semitones, going up an octave or down an octave. This can be really handy when playing in a half step down tuning. So as I'm currently in standard tuning, I can go down one semitone and then I'm in E flat. You could bring this lower, maybe minus 3 semitones. So now we're in C sharp standard. Or you could increase it by 1 semitone, and now we're in F standard. Next, we have the input mode. Depending on your interface and how many ins and outs you have, you may be able to run a stereo signal into the plugin. If so, you can select this toggle switch to go to stereo, and that means the plugin can process 2 signals independently. However, if you're using this with a guitar, which is a mono source most of the time, you can select that onto mono and you're good to go. Next to this, we then have the preset menu. So above that, we have 2 arrows, left and right. These can cycle through presets. And as you see, as I click these, we're going through all the various presets that I've loaded into the plugin. Below that, we then have the drop-down menu. Selecting this, you'll then find the default preset of the plugin, as well as artist presets and your user presets, all in various folders. As you create a new preset, you'll see that an asterisk appears next to the preset name. You can then save this by selecting Save As, select Save, and then you can save a preset. If you make any further changes to this, you can quickly then select Save, and then that preset is updated, or alternatively, you could select Delete and delete that preset if you wish. Next to Save As, there's 3 little dots. If you click that, you'll then see options to import, reset, and locate files. Import allows you to select a preset from your file directory on your computer. And if you click Reset, this means that all of the parameters on the amplifiers and devices will reset to their original values. And finally, selecting Locate File sends you straight to the preset folder locations in your file directory. Next to this, we then have the doubler. Engaging this allows you to have a widened stereo spread to your guitar signal. So without the doubler, here's how my guitar sounds. And then if I engage the doubler with the current time of 6 milliseconds, it sounds like this. This doubled effect can be accentuated and made a bit more vivid by increasing this all the way up to 20 milliseconds. And what this is going to do is add a delay between the left and right side slightly. And this can be useful to add that stereo width and mimic double tracking on an otherwise mono guitar track. Next to that, we then have the output. This is going to be a master output control for the plugin. So if the plugin is either a bit quiet and you need to up the gain, or it's too loud and it's clipping, you can use that to either reduce it or boost the output signal. At the bottom left, we then have the tuner, and this is accessible by clicking that. And this will allow you to tune with a nice clear display. At the top right, you can have an option to have a non-muted tuner, so that you can hear it as you're tuning. As well as that, you can choose to have the tuning value in cents or hertz, and this can be tuned to 440 or any specific frequency at the bottom right. And then at the middle, at the bottom here, you'll see there's a toggle switch to allow you to have a live tuner in the plugin at all times. So if we exit that, you'll then see at the bottom left, we have a visual readout of our tuning. Next to that, we've then got the MIDI setup. So selecting MIDI brings up our MIDI mappings, and this is going to be a list of all of the MIDI mapped parameters of the plugin. Almost all of the parameters in the plugin are MIDI mappable, and you can then control that with either an external foot switch or another MIDI device, and they'll all show up here. Next to this, we then have the tap section of the plugin, and here you can click tap at a desired tempo, and the BPM of the plugin will then change to that specific BPM. Next to this, we then have the metronome page. So selecting metronome brings up all of the options we can have for our metronome. We have the master volume, so this is just going to be the overall volume of the metronome. Next to that, we can choose a time signature for the metronome to click in. Next to that, we can then have a choice of sounds that are going to change the tone of the metronome, and also an option to pan the metronome in the stereo field if you wish. Below that, we've then got the BPM of the metronome, and this is going to be set to the tap tempo of the plugin as well. We can change that by tapping in another tempo, or using these arrows, increase it by steps if we want. We can then choose the subdivision of the rhythm, everything from a quarter note, eighth note triplet, or a 16th note. And then below this, we've also got a few icons that we can click to change the tone of each individual beat. And currently, we've set this to not beat on the second beat and have different tones depending on the other 3 beats. And we can start this with the play button on the right. We can also play this metronome without being on the metronome page, simply by pressing play here. Next to this, we've then got the settings page, and on this page you can configure your audio routing, everything from your audio device type, audio input and output device, the inputs and outputs you're using as well. And at the bottom, you can select your sample rate, your audio buffer size, as well as any MIDI input devices that you'd like to use to control the plugin. At the bottom right of the plugin window, you've then got a window size selector. So this can either be used to have a smaller view of everything in the plugin or a larger one if you wish. Now I'd like to show you some presets that I've made using this plugin. This preset is called Country Lead. So with this sound, I went straight to the AC20 for a nice blend of clean and break up, that kind of mid territory. The volume and power all the way up. The cut isn't all the way open, so it's still rolling off some of those highs. But I've engaged the bright switch and I haven't engaged the bass, just to keep it nice and light and prevent any unwanted low end in the lead sound. And that sounds like this. So a nice basis to add some pre-effects. Moving on to those, I've got the compressor and overdrive 1 engaged. And with the compressor pedal, I wanted to essentially give this a bit of a boost, make it easier to play, give the guitar a bit more sustain, and it does exactly that. So without the compressor, with compressor, then I engaged overdrive 1 to push it even further. I haven't added any drive, I've just used it more as a level boost and just to drive the amp harder as well. So adding that on top of that, that naturally gives a bit more overdrive as well. Moving on to the cab, I used a 57 and a condenser 184, which was a nice blend of dark and bright. I've just boosted the condenser a bit to give a bit more of that warmth within that blend. And then on the EQ, left it completely flat, so there's nothing additive going on there. Then in the post effects, I've used the tape delay and the hall reverb. With the delay, I've set this kind of modestly. It's not too obvious, but it gives it a nice width and stereo image to the lead sound, especially with the ping pong mode engaged. And that sounds like this. With the reverb, I just wanted to put it in a space and give it a decent amount of ambience and tail to the sound. So the decay and mix are fairly high, but not too intrusive. And I've also rolled off a bit of the lows and highs so that the lead sound was still focused and not too washy. And that sounds like this. This preset is called Country Slapback. With this sound, I wanted a low gain, but quite a pushed, clean type sound. And again, I went to the AC20, and this is set with the power all the way up. So it's still got enough kind of power and saturation behind it, but the volume is down a bit. So it's not giving the full power of this amp. It's still attenuated a bit, and it's not at its maximum kind of saturation, but it's still got enough grit to give it some sustain and punch for the motif that I was playing in the track. The bright switch is engaged just so you could get the attack and the string clarity out of the notes. And the bass boost is also engaged just to make it a bit thicker in the low end. And the amp by itself sounds like this. And this was a nice basis to add some pre-effects. So going onto them, I again had the compressor and overdrive 1 engaged. The compressor is just giving it some sustain and power and a bit more drive because the level's up slightly. So the compression is all the way in, same as mix, and I'm on the slow release setting just so that it remains pinned and consistent when I'm playing. Here's how it sounds without the compressor. And with. So it just keeps that dynamic range nice and narrow, whether I'm playing chords or faster. It just keeps it all consistent and all the same. Then I added overdrive 1. This, similar to the lead sound, is just going to give it a bit more mid-range and crucially a bit more level and drive. I've brought the tone back because it was getting a bit bright, but with that added in now, sounds like this. Then with the cab, I've got the same settings for the 57 and the condenser 184, but this time I've backed off the condenser mix just a bit so that the 57 brightness can come through. And on the EQ, I've ducked a bit of 2 and 4K because those bright high mids were getting a bit annoying, especially with the chicken picking stuff. And on the post effects, I've got the tape delay and the reverb again. And with the tape delay, I was going for a very quick slapback style sound. And it's something that you notice when it's not there, but it's a very authentic country sound and it needed to be present for this kind of part. So set to 1/32, so without it. And with. And that just gives it that authentic country style character. I've rolled most of the bass off to prevent it from getting in the way of the part, and I've left all the highs in on the low pass filter just to allow for that bright reflecting room type sound. And then with the reverb, I've given this a very quick decay. The decay is almost all the way off. Same for pre-delay, just very quick and snappy. And the mix is very low because I didn't want it to be long and drawn out and kind of wet. I wanted it still to be quite punchy. So without the reverb, and with, puts it in a room and makes it sound like you're in the room with the amp. This preset is called Pedal Steel. In this preset, I was going for that classic pedal steel type sound, and I immediately went to the PR12 amplifier, a nice clean basis for this very pure sound. And this has got tons of headroom, this amplifier, so I've kept it mostly flat. Dwell, reverb are both at noon because it needs reverb inherently in the sound, I think, for this, and it was the perfect flavor with that spring. And bass, it's kept at noon because it still needed a bit of warmth, but not too much. Treble, I backed off a bit because I didn't want it too bright and spiky, because you still want that soft attack that a pedal steel has. And the volume is pushed a bit just for a bit of sustain, but not saturation and clipping. So that was perfect for that. And here's how the amp sounds just by itself. And then in the pre-effects, I've got the compressor and the tremolo pedal engaged. The compressor pedal is dialed in very simply. Everything is at noon, apart from the compression dial, which is all the way in. And especially when you're using the clean tone, you need a bit more compression to allow those notes to have the sustain that a pedal steel would have. And on that point, the slow switch is engaged on the toggle switch just to keep the sustain going as long as it can. Here's how it sounds without the compressor engaged. And with the compressor. Just has a bit more life and sustain. Then with the tremolo, I wanted to have a very obvious tremolo effect to give it, again, that pedal steel character, as it's a common effect used with pedal steels. The rate is fairly modest. It's not too vivid and fast and wobbly. It's just shy of midday. The depth, again, I didn't want it to be too drastic so that the pedal steel sound came in and out. So again, that's just over midday. And the level is all the way up, just so there's a nice level going into the amplifier. Here's how it sounds without. And with. On the cabinet page, I have disengaged the 57 microphone and have kept the condenser 184 because the 57 was a bit too bright and brittle. So I boosted the level of the condenser to compensate, just so the signal was still healthy, and that was all it needed. On the EQ page, I've left that all the same, it's all flat. I've then utilised the post effects to give the pedal steel some ambience, and looking at the tape delay first, the mix is around midday. I've rolled off the low and high end just to give it a nice focus sound, not make it too big, and just to make it soft and kind of warm underneath the main dry tone. The width is all the way up, again, ping pongs on to give it a nice stereo image, and the feedback is high enough to give it a nice amount of ambience, but not to get in the way of chord changes or anything like that. Without the tape delay, sounds like this. With the tape delay. And then onto the reverb. This is set so that it's obviously got a bit of reverb to the sound. The mix is almost at 50%, so there's a very obvious reverb effect here. The decay is also pretty high, just over midday, around 12, 1 o'clock. And I've rolled off all the low end because it was getting a bit too much with this sound. It didn't need the low end because most of the material is quite high anyway. And all the top is rolled off because I didn't want a bright string sound to the reverb. I wanted it to almost just be a nice warm carpet underneath everything, similar to the mindset with the tape delay. Without the reverb, it sounds like this. And with the reverb. So that covers it for this deep dive of the Morgan Amp Suite. These three amplifiers and all of the effects are extremely versatile and can cover everything from clean, mid-breakup, all the way to soaring distorted lead tones. To find out more and to try the plugin for yourself, head on over to neuraldsp.com. I've been John Connor, thanks for watching.